In the 14th century, a prince of Portugal fell deeply in love with a woman his kingdom wanted dead. She wasn't a queen. She wasn't even supposed to be part of the royal family. But years after her murder, that prince became king. And when he finally had power, he unleashed one of the most terrifying acts of revenge in European history. According to legend, he hunted down the men responsible, tore their hearts from their bodies, and then did something even more disturbing. He dug up the corpse of the woman he loved, placed a crown on her head, and forced an entire royal court to bow before her dead body. This is the story of Pedro of Portugal and the revenge that turned a love story into a nightmare. In the early 1300s, Portugal was a fragile kingdom. Political alliances meant everything. Royal marriages were not about love, they were about power. And Prince Pedro, heir to the Portuguese throne, was expected to follow that rule. So, in 1339, he married a noblewoman named Constanza Manuel, a Castilian princess connected to one of the most powerful families in Spain. It was supposed to strengthen Portugal politically, but the marriage quickly became a disaster, because Pedro fell in love with someone else. Her name was Inês de Castro. She arrived at the Portuguese court as one of Constanza's ladies-in-arms, beautiful, intelligent, elegant, and dangerously connected to Castilian nobility. Pedro became obsessed with her almost immediately, and unlike most royal affairs, this one didn't stay secret for long. The prince spent more and more time with Inés. He ignored political expectations, ignored the warnings of the court, ignored even his own father, King Afonso IV. Soon rumors spread across the kingdom. People whispered that Pedro loved Inés more than his own wife. And after Constanza died in 1345, the situation became even worse. Pedro refused to let Inés go. Instead, he openly lived with her. They had children together. Some even believed they had secretly married. To the king, this was a catastrophe, not because of romance, but because of politics. Inés's family had strong ties to Castile, Portugal's powerful neighbor and longtime rival. The king feared her influence over Pedro, feared that her relatives would gain power inside Portugal, and feared that one day the kingdom itself could fall under Castilian control. The royal court began pressuring Afonso IV to act. Nobles warned him repeatedly. Advisors insisted the relationship threatened the stability of the crown, but Pedro refused every demand. He would not abandon Inés, and over time the king realized something terrifying. His son wasn't simply in love, he was willing to risk the entire kingdom for her. That's when Afonso made a decision that would haunt Portugal forever. If Pedro would not end the relationship, then the king would. In January of 1355, Pedro was away from Coimbra on royal business. Inés remained behind at the palace with her children. She had no idea that the king had already made his choice. Afonso IV gathered a group of trusted men. Among them were Pero Coelho, Álvaro Gonçalves, and Diogo Lopes Pacheco. Their mission was simple: kill Inés de Castro. At first, even the king hesitated. Some accounts claim he changed his mind after seeing her children begging for mercy. But the pressure from the court was immense, and eventually the order stood. The assassins entered the palace. Inés reportedly pleaded for her life. She begged for the sake of her children, but it didn't matter. The men dragged her into the gardens near the monastery of Santa Clara, and there they executed her. Some stories say she was beheaded. Others claim she was stabbed repeatedly, but every version agrees on one thing: her death was brutal. When Pedro returned and learned what happened, he exploded with rage. The woman he loved had been murdered by order of his own father, and from that moment on, revenge consumed him. Pedro launched a rebellion against the king. Civil war briefly erupted inside Portugal, father against son, king against prince. Although peace was eventually negotiated, nothing truly healed. Pedro never forgave the murder, never forgave the court, and especially never forgave the men who killed Inés. Years passed. Then in 1357, King Afonso IV died. Pedro finally became king, and now he had absolute power. The men responsible for Inés's death suddenly realized something horrifying. The grieving prince was gone, and the man replacing him wanted vengeance. The new king wasted little time. Pedro ordered a massive hunt for the assassins responsible for Inés's death. Two of them, Pero Coelho and Álvaro Gonçalves, were eventually captured after fleeing to Castile. The third escaped, but Pedro didn't care. He had enough. The executions became legendary. According to chroniclers, Pedro personally watched as the prisoners were tortured. Then came the punishment that would define his reputation forever. One man had his heart torn out through his chest, the other through his back. Pedro reportedly said it was justice because they had ripped the heart out of him first. From that point on, people began calling him Pedro the Cruel. But the most disturbing part of the story was still coming. Years after Inés's death, Pedro made an astonishing announcement. He claimed that he and Inés had secretly married before her murder. If true, that meant she had always been the rightful queen of Portugal. Then Pedro gave an order unlike anything Europe had ever seen. Inés's body was exhumed from the grave. Her corpse, decayed after years underground, was dressed in royal garments. A crown was placed on her head, and according to legend, members of the royal court were forced to kneel before her. Some stories even claim they had to kiss the hand of the dead queen. Whether every detail is true remains debated by historians, but the image became immortal. A king so consumed by grief and revenge that he crowned the woman he loved after death. Pedro later transferred Inés's remains to the monastery of Alcobaça. There he ordered two magnificent tombs to be built, one for her, one for himself, positioned face to face, so that, according to legend, when the dead rose on Judgment Day, the first thing they would see would be each other. Centuries later, the story of Pedro and Inés still feels unreal. Part romance, part political tragedy, part horror story. But beneath all the legends lies something darker. A kingdom destroyed by obsession, a father who ordered murder to protect his crown, and a king whose grief turned into monstrous revenge. History remembers Pedro not only because he loved deeply, but because he refused to let death end that love. Even now, inside the monastery of Alcobaça, the tombs of Pedro and Inés remain facing one another in silence, waiting for the end of time and reminding the world that sometimes the most terrifying stories are true.